Coming up on Nebraska Stories, a Civil War quilt with a Nebraska connection. The Husker family supports one of their own. Revisiting the early days of KMMJ radio, harvesting native prairie seeds, and waking the beds of a sunken garden.
I'll let you all put that on the table. The log cabin quilt is probably the most iconic of all quilt patterns. They're one of the most successful and most interesting patterns that we see in American quilt making.
Functional and beautiful, quilts have traditionally been the art form of women. Here at the International Quilt Study Center and Museum, these meticulously crafted textiles are preserved from around the world.
Now we're going to slide it to the end of the table.
And though the quilts are preserved, the stories of their makers are usually lost to time. But even then, there are exceptions.
Caroline's story is so interesting because it really tells us about a woman's life at a time when we don't know a lot of women's stories.
Quilt maker Caroline Boston lived during one of the most polarized times in American history. She was a young married mother when her husband James left to fight in the Union Army during the Civil War. Within 6 months, James was gravely wounded. When he was moved to a military hospital in St. Louis, Caroline would make an unusual decision for a woman of her time.
Caroline left the children with family in DeKalb, Illinois, and had volunteered to become an Army Civil War nurse. She had no previous training, but she was trained at Benton Barracks.
Caroline would be one of 20,000 women to volunteer in military hospitals during the Civil War. She would remain at Benton Barracks until her husband's medical discharge in April of 1864.
Every time I think about that story, I can't imagine making the decision. It wasn't to leave the children, it was to do something. It was to help the war effort.
The extent of Caroline's charitable efforts didn't end with the war. When James was medically discharged from the Army, the Bostons began a new life on a homestead near Du Bois, Nebraska. It was while living here that Caroline's generosity and quilt making was first noted in the local newspaper. For the next 30 years, the Bostons were a part of the Du Bois community. But when they lost their farm in the Depression of the 1890s, they moved on to Kansas.
I think there's a strong connection with Smith Center, Kansas, where the great-great-grandparents moved in 1894, and those soldiers that are on the quilt.
Sometime around the turn of the 20th century, Caroline made a quilt inscribed with the names of 320 Union veterans of the Civil War and their associated military units.
Caroline Boston was obviously making this quilt because that time for her in the Civil War when she served obviously was hugely impactful for her, and she wanted to memorialize that over time.
When the Bostons moved to Smithfield, Kansas, they became involved with the Grand Army of the Republic, a veterans organization for Union soldiers. James was a member of the GAR, and Caroline a member of the Women's Auxiliary, called the Women's Relief Corps. Caroline's descendants believe it was her association with this group that inspired her to create a quilt honoring war veterans.
When we've researched all 320 names, we've nailed down at least 315 individuals. We know who they were definitely. So there's 2 black soldiers, at least 1 black soldier, Benjamin Davenport, we know was a slave before the war. William McKinley is on the quilt.
It's in impeccable condition for a quilt that's well over 100 years old.
Civil War-era quilts are rare. Caroline's is especially unique, not only because of the names inscribed on it, but also because we know the story of the maker. Caroline's quilt was handed down through 4 of her descendants before it was recently gifted to the International Quilt Study Center and Museum.
The family wasn't sure what they were going to do with the quilt. They weren't quite ready to give it up.
We were so impressed with the museum and the staff. Just a wonderful group of people and a facility that's world-class.
Today, Caroline's family gathers to officially present her quilt to the Quilt Center.
It's nice to meet you, Gladys, and I wanted to say thank you very much for trusting this piece to us. We will take very good care of it.
My vision was that someday I was going to die and they were going to sell it for $5 at a yard sale. We decided this was really the best place for it.
Gladys is the end of the maternal line, so she never got married, never had kids, so what's going to happen to it?
I'm sure that Caroline Boston had no idea that her quilt was going to end up in a museum, 130 years later. It's a benchmark in our collection, and it's become really important. And as time passes, it will only gain in importance as a record of that.
Just knowing the quality of this museum and the care they'll give it, Gladys felt that it was coming back home. It was coming back to Nebraska.
Erin Sorensen usually reports the news, specifically what's happening in and around Nebraska's athletic teams. Never did she think she'd become it on a quiet night in February.
You just don't really understand the full impact of what has happened to you until after the fact. And that was a night that I thankfully don't relive. It hasn't haunted me, which is a blessing, but there's certain things you'll never forget. That was actually my boyfriend's birthday, and we had plans for the whole weekend, so that night was gonna be just really low-key. And we got to the top of the hill and then, didn't come home for 5 days. We were hit by a drunk driver. He was distracted and just driving way too fast and reckless, and he was going about 80 miles an hour in a residential. I don't think I'll ever forget just the sound and kind of knowing instantly that something wasn't right out of that. And knowing that I walked out and immediately kind of went into that state of shock. Jax gets really upset when people cry. But just going into that state of shock and knowing instantly that I almost felt like I needed to go home. I needed to get somewhere else. I am like a social media nut, so I knew pretty quickly that this was going to get out. I would say Nebraska fans led the charge. I think people came out of the woodwork because somebody who was a Nebraska fan, who knew the person who followed me on Twitter, heard about it, and therefore felt compelled to then follow me and also reach out. It's hard even today because I feel like there's just no way for me to thank people, because not only was I getting, messages from friends and family, but then this just group of people who had never met me before were just flooding my social media pages with love and support. And the day before spring camp was supposed to begin, so spring football, I was feeling pretty sorry for myself because in my head, I had these ideas that I was gonna progress a lot faster than I had. And that was the day that I was sitting on my couch and the doorbell rang, and it was the mail carrier, and he had a box, and it was a signed football from Coach Riley and his staff, and then a hat from Sean Eichhorst, and both of them with notes to me basically saying, You know, we wish you were going to be there for spring football. We can't wait to see you back at Memorial Stadium. And it was just so kind, because you go to those practices and you report on their team and you don't expect anything from it. And I don't think that they will ever understand what that meant, because it was just like, I didn't know that they knew I existed. And I didn't expect anyone to comfort me. I didn't expect anyone to go, Erin, it's okay. We miss you here.
The kindness of those within Nebraska athletics, combined with the passionate support of Husker fans, helped Erin recover to do the job she loves.
I would tell anyone that reached out to me, thank you, and that I wish I could meet you personally and say thank you. I'm a University of Nebraska alum. I've sung the fight song hundreds of times before, but I've never really truly understood, you know, there is no place like Nebraska until this happened. And I would argue anyone until the cows come home, there really is no place like Nebraska.
This time the egg came first. M.M. Johnson's company made incubators in Clay Center. He named them after his dog, Trusty. A successful business, but Johnson thought he could do more if there was just a better way to get the word out about the company.
Mr. Johnson was a very forethinker, and so he decided to build a radio station as a form of advertising.
KMMJ, MMJ for M.M. Johnson, hatched in 1925. It quickly became a big deal for the small town.
We have letters and different documents of where the signal from the radio station was heard all over the country.
People came from all over the country to visit that radio station.
It brought people to the town, not only to live, but many visitors came to visit the KMMJ studio.
Their building was so large that it was kind of like a strip mall that we call today. They had a barber shop and a cafe and different stores in it besides just the radio station.
The thing that sticks out in my mind was that they had quite a large grocery store in the radio station and sold all kinds of stuff.
They did live performances, and you could come in and sit down and watch, whoever was performing.
There was quite a bit of entertainment here all the time.
The live performances, the people that were here, and those who went on to become famous stars other places. And, that's special.
There was a lot going on here.
And then there wasn't. In 1939, KMMJ moved from Clay Center to Grand Island. Today, the Clay County Historical Society sits where the radio station used to. But inside, the spirit of KMMJ lives on.
What makes the prairie? Historically, it would have been a lot of things.
It's an autumn Saturday afternoon at the Homestead Monument of America in Beatrice, Nebraska. And a handful of volunteers get a quick history lesson from Jesse Bully, the monument's natural resource specialist.
This is the site of the first homestead claim that was filed in the United States. We were created back in 1936 to tell the story of the Homestead Act of 1862. And the impacts that that law had on the United States of America.
The monument is a historical site, but today's focus won't be on history. the volunteers are here for a bit of botany.
We're on the very western edge of the tallgrass prairie region. It's known for its very deep, dark, fertile soils. Most of that area has been converted to farmland. By some estimates, less than 1% of the original prairie remains in the United States.
Armed with brown paper lunch sacks, Bully and the volunteers head out to the ground's 100 acres of restored tallgrass prairie.
You're gathering native prairie seeds for use in future maintenance and restoration efforts here at the monument. We're going to focus, like I said, mainly on the warm season grasses. And so this one here is the Indian grass, harvesting the seed. All we're doing is just stripping it off and put it in your bag. We're trying to collect as much seed as we can, so if we need it in the future, we can use the native local eco-type seed.
This is a small operation. The volunteers and Bully work for a few hours, filling their sacks and enjoying the sun.
Boy, talk about Zen prairie experience. And it's a nice day to do it.
In the end, they'll have a 5-gallon bucket filled with a mix of seeds, ranging from milkweed to Indian grass, that will go into storage with seeds from other collection days. These seeds will be on hand if heavy rains create a washout on the grounds, or if areas need to be restored from man-made projects. This ounce of preparation today could go a long way in making future emergencies more bearable. Staff at the monument know they've got seed that is adapted to their area. Seeds that are ordered online may not be adapted to the climate or environment if they travel long distances. An hour and a half northwest in Aurora, Nebraska, Mike Bullerman of the Prairie Plains Resource Institute understands.
Prairie seed is not one size fits all.
Not at all. These barrels, these 5 mixes, represent about 250 different species that we collect throughout the growing season. Our approach is to do what we call high diversity local ecotype, which means we collect as many species as we can throughout a growing season, and it all needs to come from wild local populations. So they are best suited to do well in any range of conditions.
Harvested by hand and by combine, the barrels represent different topography and different times of the growing season. Preparing to spread seed at a site requires a recipe with the right combination of wetland versus dryland barrels and seeds from throughout spring, summer, and fall.
These barrels here are the combine harvested main grasses, big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass. This particular site requires a recipe of 5 of these combine barrels for every 1 barrel of blended seed mix.
The rest of the recipe just calls for some good old-fashioned labor. Despite the dust and the sweat, Sarah Bailey, the greenhouse manager and restoration assistant, says it's still a process she can enjoy.
When we mix and go through the process of creating a mix, you're seeing all that hard work from the harvest go into something where there's, anywhere from 100 to 200 species, and that's going to get out on the ground and become a natural area that's going to be awesome in the future.
It probably is my favorite. This is where the rubber hits the road, or where the seeds hit the ground, I guess. This piece of land has been in a traditional soybean corn rotation up until 2014. It was allowed to go fallow in 2015, and at that time they did some excavation to create some wetlands. Then after that, it was shredded and disked to prepare the seedbed for what we're doing today, which is doing a high diversity local ecotype prairie and wetland seeding. I always say that we're using a mix of old and new technology. We've got a couple of 4-wheelers pulling 1950s vintage, what were meant to be fertilizer spreaders, but now they're seed spreaders. They just drop the seed on top of the ground. And we also have GPS units mounted on those, so we know where we are at any time in the process. And here it says just over 2 miles is 3 acres. So there's that looks like about 4.5 acres worth of seed yet. So a lot of ideas come into my head throughout the restoration process, and one of those is that these plants that we're working with are the progeny of what were here prior to settlement. Genetically, it represents what's left of Nebraska's natural history. Metaphorically, it represents the future. We're planting seeds, creating prairie plant communities for not only wildlife habitat, but for public to enjoy.
In 1905, the land was given to the city by the Fry family. They owned a series of greenhouses in town, and so it sort of sat here for almost 30-some years until 1930, when Ernest Bear, who was a city commissioner, decided that he needed to do something to lift the spirits of people in Lincoln that were going through depression at the time. So in the 1930s is when the idea for building a garden here actually started. That's when they started to piece together the monies to build it, and then how to hire people to put it in. And it was developed with the idea of just being a very, very beautiful place is all it really was.
This is the 85th year that the garden has been planted.
Every year we do this, what we call Wake Up the Beds, which is the annual planting of sunken gardens, and it's a great opportunity to get the community involved. We plant over 30,000 annuals, and it's something people look forward to. And without the help of the community, it'd really be a challenge to get it done.
The thing that I think that is amazing is that Lincoln has continued to embrace this. And in some communities, this would have gone away, but not in Lincoln. You know, it gets better and better every year and gets more and more support.
So we get about 100 volunteers, and then we have staff, and we divide into teams. We kind of do a planting demonstration showing people how to properly plant the annuals. And then it's really just kind of, you have camaraderie with your team as you go through the different areas of the park, and by the end of the day, you've created new friendships and gotten to know people that you might not otherwise get to know.
Alice Reed and I redesign the annual garden every year, and the process involved is basically coming up with an idea that is very colorful, because that's what annuals can do. And we sort of tie different elements together in the design. We like to have a good color play, but we like to, like this year, it's all things Seuss. We want to play off of something that everybody's familiar with.
I think this is going to be great this year. There's lots of pattern, lots of color. And I'm always impressed what Steve and Alice do every year to come up with a new theme. We have people asking us well in advance, what is the theme going to be for next year? They always want to know what the theme is for the current year. The amazing thing about this place is the bananas will be probably 8, 10, 12 foot tall. The caladiums with leaves, you know, as big as hula hoops. And I think the kids just have a great place. This is truly a magical place. They come down here, and there's no place like this in Lincoln. There's no place like this probably within the region. It's just an amazing place.
Watch our stories online at netnebraska.org/Nebraska Stories, and go to Facebook to like us and leave a comment. Join the Nebraska Stories conversation. Nebraska Stories is funded by the Margaret and Martha Thomas Foundation, the Nebraska Department of Roads Highway Safety Office, the Nebraska Tourism Commission, and First Nebraska Bank. Sustained funding for arts coverage on Nebraska Stories is provided by the H. Lee and Carol Gendler Charitable Fund.